In 1861, Boston, USA, Julian Carter was 10 years old when his mother brought him, wrapped in a grey wool cloak, to the registrar's office to certify what looked like a man in his 30s. His beard was patchy, his hands trembled, and his spine curved with a visible hunch. Yet the date on his baptismal record, November 3, 1851, was unaltered and verified. Julian's eyes blinked slowly in the daylight, as if unused to it, and when the clerk asked his name, the voice that answered was hoarse and low, as though aged by decades of use. The Carters were a merchant-class family from East Boston, known for their punctual church attendance and for publishing medical pamphlets on childhood nutrition. The boy's case was quietly documented in the Massachusetts Board of Health files, next to reports of arsenic-based tonics and rising infant mortality in overcrowded neighborhoods. By 1859, Julian had already aged 84 observable months in a single year, according to a private physician's affidavit. What secret did the Carter family protect inside their shuttered attic room? The first time someone outside the Carter household remarked on Julian's condition was in the winter of 1857, during an unusually bitter storm that froze the harbor and cracked the wood of the dock posts. Mrs. Emmeline Varney, a widow who rented the lower flat across the alley, told a midwife in a church confessional that she had heard an old man weeping like a child through the Carter attic wall. She claimed the sound came nightly around the second hour after curfew, when snowflakes tapped against the shutters like fingernails, and when her own lamp began to dim for lack of oil. At first she assumed it was Mr. Carter, overcome by drink or worry. But the voice was too frail, she said, and broke too easily into sobs. Then on January 13th, she saw what she swore was a fully grown man peering down from the attic dormer window, bare-chested, pale as bone, clutching a stuffed cloth rabbit. The schoolmistress at Tileston Street School had submitted a formal concern. She wrote that Julian had begun the term in 1856 as an unusually quiet but bright-eyed child of good manners and appetite. By December, she noted, his handwriting had changed drastically, grown sharper, angular, and overly precise, resembling that of an adult clerk. More disturbingly, his clothing required daily modification. Button seams burst. His shoes split at the sides. The class began to complain of a sour odor whenever he passed. His posture was stooped. His voice deepened audibly each week. By February, he was removed from class without explanation. The schoolmistress's letter, however, was quietly copied and archived under a file labeled Premature Senescence Alleged Case. In one of his logs, he scribbled, "Boy doesn't come to door, curtains smell of mildew, can hear coughing upstairs, but different somehow. Old coughing." He was not prone to exaggeration, having worked the dock district routes for 9 years without complaint. Still, he stopped short of reporting his concerns. But by late spring of 1858, the garden had overgrown wildly, ivy creeping up the shutter hinges, violets blooming in awkward places. Several panes of the upper windows had been painted over from inside. A physician named Dr. Luther Peabody, who resided 2 streets north, visited once each fortnight between March and July. His carriage parked after sundown, and he exited wearing gloves even in heat. When a local apothecary assistant recognized Peabody's handwriting in a requisition for lanolin, lye, and mercury chloride, he noted it in his shop ledger with a question mark. Those were not standard compounds for treating a child's fever. At King's Chapel, where they had once volunteered for every charity roster, they now entered late and left before the benediction. Julian was never seen again by anyone in the pews after the summer of 1857. Rumors circulated that he had been sent to relatives in Maine. But a delivery boy, Matthew Keneally, once caught a glimpse through the cracked back door in August 1858 and described a figure limping down the hallway in a long shirt, skin like candle wax and hair gone on one side. He told this to his older brother, who laughed, then to a constable who did not. He reviewed the church records, the school file, and the street inspector's reports for anomalies. The 1859 property tax form showed a significant rise in indoor firewood usage and an unusually large payment to a carpenter named Abner Flint, who had no listed shop but was known to do discreet attic renovations for clients who preferred privacy. When Thorne questioned Flint in a tavern, The man went pale and denied ever working for the Carters, then changed the subject to the weather. Something moving upstairs. Could not see face, sounded like dragging steps and labored breath. He requested a formal inspection but was denied by city clerks, citing lack of probable cause. Still, he continued compiling indirect evidence. Her statement was brief. There was a rope ladder leading to the attic. Once I smelled something like spoiled milk and saw what I thought were adult teeth on a rag near the washing tub. I said nothing. I just left. But behind drawn curtains there were signs of continued habitation. Glowing candlelight, brief silhouettes against the wall. And on one particular evening in November, a chimney sweep named Calvin Durrant claimed that from the rooftop, while clearing soot, he looked down into an uncovered attic skylight and saw a naked man-child crouched by a mirror, weeping and pulling hair from his own head. Durrant's testimony was recorded in a trade journal for apprentices under a cautionary section titled Unexplained Households. He wrote, "He looked no older than 15 in form, but aged like my father in face. His spine bent like a sickle. He mouthed words I could not hear. Then he looked up." Constable Thorne was reassigned to another district, and a brief notice appeared in the Boston Courier, stating that Mr. and Mrs. Carter had filed paperwork to legally declare their son deceased, citing long-term degenerative illness with no possibility of public burial. No death certificate was issued. Yet on March 2, 1861, a clerk at the city registrar's office accepted a live identification of Julian Carter for the purpose of resolving a clerical discrepancy. That clerk, Edwin Rokes, described the boy's appearance in a private journal. A child's height, a man's face, fingers that twitched and eyes that didn't blink, skin papery. When he spoke, it hurt to listen. By mid-1861, the Carter property had become a place of whispered warnings. Boys dared each other to run past it after sunset, claiming they'd seen a lamp flicker in the attic window or caught the shape of a silhouette hunched against the glass. A seamstress named Margaret Bell, who lived 3 doors down and often stitched garments for the local clergy, described how birds no longer landed on the Carter rooftop. She'd noticed it in spring, when other houses saw nests forming under eaves. Their chimneys stood clean and unused, despite the fact that thin trails of smoke were sometimes seen rising from it after midnight. He cross-referenced birth logs, census entries, medical files, and parish correspondence. What emerged disturbed him enough to write a private memorandum. Subject Carter, Julian. Unusual physiological data. Absence of corroborating burial but recorded as deceased. Discrepancy in timeline of visible aging versus chronological age. Hypothesis: non-natural degeneration or concealed experimentation. Detected strong ammonia odor. Heard voice through flue. Voice belonged to a man but speech pattern halting. Repeated phrase, "I was not born for this." Greeley submitted the form without signature and requested a route change within the month. It was anonymous, and it contained several sheets of fine vellum inscribed with anatomical sketches, painstakingly detailed renderings of human vertebrae in progressive states of collapse, mandibles shriveled and molars ground flat, fingertips elongated with unnatural curvature. On one page was written in fine cursive, J.C., progression month by month, March 1857 through August 1861. A second note folded separately read only, "Each year costs him more than the last." Neighbors reported odd deliveries, crates of raw eggs, goat's milk by the gallon, sacks of chalk, crushed oyster shells, items believed at the time to support bone health in invalids. A grocer named Elias Woodfield delivered twice weekly. In his notebook he wrote, "Orders made by paper note, left in box by door, always paid in coin. Once note was shaky, letters scattered, spilled ink or shaking hand, cannot tell." Last delivery asked for quiet cabbage unbruised. By December, more records began to diverge. In the city census draft prepared for the coming year, Julian Carter was not listed. But in the financial ledgers for water use, the Carter property showed an unusual spike, more than triple the average for homes of their size. The increase occurred entirely during night hours, between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., as recorded by the mechanical meter trial implemented in their district. It suggested prolonged bathing or washing activity, possibly to treat an infection or condition requiring continual hygiene. Others whispered darker speculations of induced growth of something kept alive beyond its time. Strong suspicion of concealment. He claimed it was a handkerchief soaked in blood and something else dark and oily. Before he could retrieve it, a man's face appeared behind the broken pane and stared directly at him. Watts described it as a face young and old all at once, like a boy inside a grandfather. The item on the roof was gone by dawn. Richard Pell, ordering sedatives, laudanum and bloodletting instruments on behalf of a chronic patient unable to travel. The delivery address matched that of the Carter home. In early spring of 1863, a letter arrived at the offices of the Boston Atlas, unsigned and written in a rushed, slanted hand. It was addressed to the editor, but marked confidential, and its contents were brief. There is a child at 78 Farrow Street who is no longer a child. No parish has buried him. He still breathes. Go at night. Listen through the attic wall. The editor dismissed it as madness, but a young journalist named Franklin Bell, eager to make his name, took an interest. Within a week, he stood outside the Carter home under a cloudless dusk, notebook in hand, ink already smudging from the mist that clung to the cobblestones. He waited in silence for over an hour, recording the occasional twitch of the curtain, the faint tap of a shutter knocked by unseen movement. Then, just before midnight, he heard it. A low groaning from the attic, drawn out and rhythmic, like air escaping from a pressed lung. He returned the next night and again heard the sound. On the third night, he brought a stethoscope he had borrowed from his brother-in-law, a medical student, and pressed it to the outer brick near the attic window. He later wrote, in an unpublished manuscript, "It was not one voice. It was two, one whispering in a child's cadence and the other deeper, older, full of pain, but the timing of the breath between them was identical." Meanwhile, a young deacon named Elias Coates from Christchurch had begun receiving confessions from a former Carter servant, a mute woman known only as Lucinda. She scribbled notes during their sessions, trembling with each line. According to Coates's transcriptions, she claimed that Julian Carter was not growing but repeating, and that his face would clear some days, then wrinkle again. She described being ordered to feed him through a slot in the attic door, and that sometimes she heard him crying and other times laughing, but never in a way that matched his age or voice. Most disturbingly, she drew a sketch of a figure with one side of its body youthful and the other aged, like two halves existing in conflict. No official church inquiry followed. Coates was reassigned to a rural parish outside Worcester within weeks. His journal entries stop abruptly in May 1863. His notes remain partially intact. Declined further entry without cause. A colleague presented him with the unsigned anatomical sketches once received by Professor Marston, now gathering dust in the college archive. The case intrigued Winfield. He traced the mailing address on the envelope to a corner print shop, where records showed it had been paid in coin by a gloved man who refused to sign. What he found was contradiction after contradiction. One document declared Julian deceased. Another listed him as non-participating minor. The school ledger recorded advanced handwriting and postural abnormality. A water usage report indicated near-constant attic activity. Yet all official visits had been deflected or redirected. He sent a formal letter requesting a consultation, offering discretion and the possibility of medical help. It was returned unopened. A second letter, sent by courier, disappeared entirely. But inside her empty house, a draft letter was found on her sewing table, half-written with the words, "They carry something up there. I hear it, every Thursday. It walks like a man, but whimpers like a babe. No ink smudges." The page was dated the same day she vanished. Winfield, undeterred, acquired a sketch map of the Carter home from city building records and began to mark areas of interest, entryways, vents, the layout of the attic. He devised a plan to enter the property unofficially, but before he could act, he received a visit from a solicitor representing the Carter estate, warning of legal action for harassment. That same evening, his personal residence was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but all notes related to Julian Carter were removed from his study desk. The locks had not been forced, His handwriting, however, matched several prescriptions issued across 3 different apothecaries in Boston, all under different patient names. Each script requested mercury or opiate-based compounds. She presented them in a letter to the city medical examiner's office. The letter was lost in transit. On All Hallows' Eve, a group of boys placed a ladder against the back wall, hoping to glimpse the attic's secrets. What they saw drove one of them to vomiting and the other 2 to silence. They told no story, gave no detail, only that they had heard the words repeated twice. "I don't know what year it is." Horses slowed their gait when passing it, and for the first time, even the city's night patrols began walking their beats with deliberate detours. And a collection of pressed herbs, brittle with age. The first few pages appeared to be the writings of a child, filled with diary entries in uneven cursive. But as the pages continued, the handwriting changed, becoming more deliberate, the language more formal, even clinical. The tone shifted from wonder to dread. Someone wanted it removed. On January 14th, a chimney sweep named Ely Manning, newly arrived from New Haven, accepted a job on Farrow Street. The Carter residence was on his list. He returned early, pale and shaking, telling his supervisor that he'd refused to climb the final roof. When pressed, he only said, "It talks to itself, but not in words." His journal records 27 entries regarding the Carter property. 17 of those entries describe an odor resembling copper, vinegar, and coal smoke, while 6 mention sounds of pacing and 4 mention chanting, or the impression of chanting, without discernible language. Helmsley submitted a proposal to open a public inquiry into the property. The petition vanished in committee. That same month, a printing error in the city's census ledger temporarily re-added Julian Carter's name under juvenile male dependents. A clerk noticed the mistake when attempting to cross-reference the family's tax filings. But the more alarming detail was not the name's appearance. It was the age listed next to it, 46. The handwriting did not match any of the 3 clerks assigned to the Census Bureau. The column had been filled in by hand, with ink that resisted all attempts at removal. The page was torn out and burned the following morning. A group of amateur investigators, among them Franklin Bell, now returned from Baltimore, began collecting first-hand accounts. They mapped out timelines, correlated sightings, and published an unofficial broadside titled "The Boy in the Attic." Only 100 copies were printed. 97 were confiscated by local police within 3 days. Formerly of Concord, she had experience in chronic growth disorders and had consulted on several controversial cases. She traveled to Boston in April 1864 and attempted to approach the Carter home. Her report, written 2 days later in a Boston lodging house, described the encounter. His voice was measured, but the skin around his mouth cracked with dryness. I asked about Julian. He replied, "He is here, but not in the way you remember." I asked to see him. He said, "That depends on what you mean by see." He then closed the door without another word. Not gasping or wheezing, but deliberate, measured, each breath separated by exactly 6 seconds. Firemen working to contain the blaze noticed that while most nearby homes remained dark and vacant, the Carter attic window was lit with an orange glow that flickered too steadily to be flame. One firefighter, Henry Lowell, later testified in a private interview that he saw a man's face in the window, pressed to the glass, eyes wide, mouth open but unmoving for several minutes, like a mask, not flesh. His superior officer dismissed the claim. But when a routine damage survey was conducted 2 days later, the inspector's notes on the Carter property were redacted. Only the date and parcel number remained. The inspector, Amos Berridge, resigned that same week and disappeared from Boston records entirely. One tenant in a boarding house claimed that her fingernails began to split in vertical lines and blamed the water supply. A private water test revealed nothing unusual, but the well nearest the Carter residence was sealed within the month. He had no head trauma, no broken bones, but he did not wake for 6 days. When he did, he spoke only 2 words before lapsing into silence. "He's shrinking." Inside was a single page torn from a school ledger, marked 1857. The name Julian Carter had been underlined in red ink, with a scribbled note beside it. "Voice doesn't match age. Memory inconsistent, skin loose at elbows, eyes look away too slowly. No sender was listed. Barrett never spoke of it, but a month later her house was found empty, belongings left in place, a kettle cooling on the stove. Neighbors said she had recently been ill, but no physician ever filed a record. Her departure was never reported to the authorities. A worker sent to inspect the foundation found the back stair rotted entirely through. Yet the upper floor showed signs of recent reinforcement. Fresh timber, still smelling of resin, had been carried through the back alley. No one saw who delivered it. But from the attic window of the Carter home, the same flickering glow persisted. Steady, pale, almost pulsing. A milkman, walking before dawn, saw a small object fall from the eaves onto the snow. He approached cautiously and found a child's glove, stiff with age. The leather cracked and curled, yet impossibly large. Too large for a child's hand, but too small for any man's. On March 6, 1865, under an overcast sky that never cleared, a notice was delivered to the Office of Building Safety regarding structural instability at 78 Farrow Street. The report cited a cracked rear beam, leaning chimney, and persistent mold growth affecting adjacent properties. The complaint had no author and bore no official seal, but its language mimicked the city's inspection format convincingly enough to compel action. 3 men were dispatched that afternoon: Samuel Pitts, a surveyor, Henry Arlo, a municipal carpenter, and Thomas Lyle, a records assistant instructed to document conditions for legal processing. Inside, the air was warm but stale. Dust hung visibly in the shafts of light that pierced the curtains. Lyle described the immediate smell as bitter-sweet rot, like overripe fruit left near a chemical wash. Every wooden surface, banister, floorboard, trim, seemed faintly sticky, as though repeatedly wiped clean but never dry. They announced themselves, but no reply came. The parlor held covered furniture. A ticking mantel clock stopped at 3:12, and a cold stove with its ashpan empty. The air thickened with each rise. On the top landing, behind a locked door of reinforced oak, a sound reached them. Light, repeated tapping, not mechanical, not animal, deliberate. Arlo produced a chisel and hammer. With steady blows, they broke the latch. The door gave way with a deep sigh of wood and hinges, and they entered. Immediately, the smell intensified: copper, lanolin, mildew, and something pungent like preserved meat. Windows had been painted black from the inside. A single oil lamp on the floor cast flickering light. The walls were lined with shelves, rows of jars, stacked papers, worn linens. On the far side of the room, under the sloped ceiling, stood a single iron-framed cot. On it lay a figure, covered by a sheet. The form beneath the sheet was curled inward, knees to chest as if shivering. Lyle began to raise his ledger but froze when the shape shifted. A slow, spasmodic twitch of one hand, then a rustling breath, long and painful. Arlo stepped forward and drew back the sheet. The face was twisted by time, lined with deep folds, but the eyes were wide, youthful, confused. Patches of scalp were bald, others sprouting hair in inconsistent tufts. Teeth were worn flat, except for 4 oversized molars that jutted at uneven angles. The skin, both papery and taut in places, seemed to hang differently depending on the limb. The right foot looked nearly infantile, the left, gnarled with calluses and joint deformity. It blinked. Lyle dropped his ledger. A second cot, obscured behind a privacy screen, began to shake slightly. They approached and found a smaller form, unmoving, the sheet over it untouched. Arlo pulled it back. Arlo touched the chest. It did not rise, yet the skin yielded softly under his finger. Requesting mirror removed. Floating in yellowed fluid, another jar contained a child's milk tooth embedded in grey tissue. One by one, they realized, every artifact catalogued a stage. Every item documented a cycle. He looked older than expected, hair almost white, face drawn, shoulders sunken, but his voice was clear when he spoke. "You should not be here." He touched the edge of the blanket and adjusted it with trembling fingers. To document, we hoped that with time he would simply finish, but the loops shortened, the gaps between began to vanish. Now, there are 2. One who remembers, one who begins. We have run out of space. This is containment. The light flooded the room for less than a second, searing the moment onto glass plate. Julian screamed. By the morning of March 7, 1865, word of what had been seen inside 78 Farrow Street had begun to circulate, not through newspapers or official channels, but whispered from office to office, traded in hallways of government buildings, and passed in notes between medical students. Lyle's photograph had been delivered to the Boston Office of Public Records under seal, accompanied by a brief summary written in shorthand. Only 2 clerks were permitted to view it. The 3 who had entered, Pitts, Arlo, and Lyle, had filed no formal complaints. No reports were signed. Their testimony existed only in fragments. Lyle left Boston a week later. Arlo returned to his workshop and was not seen again in city records after April. Pitts withdrew from municipal surveying and spent his final years in a convalescent hospital, speaking rarely and refusing all mention of Farrow Street. The house remained under quiet observation, but no officials approached it again. On March 10th, a letter was received by the Boston Medical College, bearing only the initials J.C. The handwriting was inconsistent, letters slanting forward and backward in the same sentence. It read, "The privacy screen, the jars, the papers, all missing." In their place was a single wooden chair and a folded cloth on the floor. On the cloth lay 3 items: a child's leather shoe, cracked at the heel, a folded page from a school reader, and a brass hairbrush with long white strands coiled around the teeth. The city soon posted a condemnation order on the front door, but no demolition followed. Contractors assigned to the site withdrew their bids after walking the perimeter. One claimed to feel dizzy near the southern wall. Another reported hearing 2 sets of steps following him along the back garden. One foreman, Thomas Dearborn, scrawled in his logbook, "Too quiet, something wrong in the windows, house doesn't feel vacant, feels paused." Dated January 29, 1865, it read, "Without death, without a clear crime, there was nothing to prosecute. Yet those in adjacent buildings began filing more complaints of moisture damage, warping wood, and spreading mildew. A clerk who worked in the property deeds office for that block noted that the ink on Carter's property line had faded. Not smudged, faded, as if the record itself were withdrawing. Harriet Dunley was received by the American Medical Journal. It detailed her encounter from 1864 and described her belief that Julian Carter suffered from a degenerative cellular regeneration disorder hitherto unclassified, and warned of mental deterioration inconsistent with chronological development. She ended her letter with a question. If the body persists but the mind decays, how many times can a person restart before they are no longer themselves? That summer, a window pane from the Carter attic shattered from the inside. The cause was never explained. A neighbor claimed she heard singing just prior, a nursery rhyme, faltering and off-key. The lyrics were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakably that of a young child, layered with a deeper undercurrent, as though 2 voices sang at once. The milkman stopped his rounds. The city mapped the street but left the Carter plot blank, with twine. Inside, a finger joint, too large for a child, too smooth for a man, still supple with cartilage. No explanation accompanied it. The archivist, Walter Blaine, left his position within the week. He would later testify that he began to forget details of his own name after handling the bundle. The Boston Office of Public Records expunged the Carter household file from its main archive, citing record inconsistencies, contradictory dates, and failure to confirm subject's death. The file was placed in a separate holding unit for disputed identities. It remains there, unindexed. But each year, on the same date in November, a letter is delivered to the city clerk's desk with no return address. Inside is a single word: again. A quiet consensus took hold among clerks, inspectors, and surveyors. The less attention drawn to the property, the better. Their names ceased to appear in local church rosters, business ledgers, and charitable records. To those who asked, the response was mechanical. They moved for health reasons. When visitors asked about the boarded house with the flickering attic window, residents replied, "It's always been that way," even when they knew otherwise. Though no patient was named, the paper cited first-hand examination of a subject whose cellular age could not be reconciled with chronological time. The article was rejected for lack of reproducible data. The physician's license was quietly revoked 2 months later for non-compliance with record-keeping standards. No charges were filed. Cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but his assistant noted that the professor had become obsessed in his final weeks with duplicating one particular drawing, half child, half man, spine folding in on itself. Each version was more detailed than the last. His final rendering had no eyes. Horace Winfield formally withdrew from public inquiry and published a brief editorial distancing himself from sensationalistic interpretations of isolated anomalies. When questioned by peers, he denied any involvement with the Carter matter. However, a janitor at the hospital claimed to have seen Winfield destroy a parcel containing what looked like a bone wrapped in linen. The janitor resigned soon after. Among municipal circles, the phrase "the Faro anomaly" began to appear in handwritten margins and internal logs. It served not as reference, but as warning. Surveyors skipped the block. Postmasters ceased routing letters addressed to the residents, even when delivered by hand. The left hand is shrinking now. Despite multiple ownership transfers, the house at 78 Faro remained untouched. No buyers approached. Contractors refused entry. One prospective surveyor, an Irishman named Quinn, reportedly spent 15 minutes inside before stumbling out and vomiting on the cobblestones. He was heard muttering, "It breathes, the house breathes through the floors." No demolition order was filed. A single iron fence was installed around the perimeter, padlocked but not maintained. Over time, vines grew along the railings. Ivy climbed the windows. And yet, each November, a light returned behind the attic curtain, steady for 1 week, always extinguished by the morning of the 12th. Teachers skipped the street when assigning historical walking tours, but the story lingered in private. A school librarian recalled overhearing a student mutter the phrase "starting again" after waking from a brief fainting spell in class. The student had never been to Faro Street. The school registry bearing Julian Carter's signature was lost during a relocation of files. Lyle's ledger, once preserved in the municipal archives, was reported stolen during a flood that affected only the South Annex, oddly, the only section where his journal was stored. It was brittle with age and spotted with ink. The handwriting matched early entries. It read, "Oilskin bundle." When approached, the boy said only, "I'm trying to remember which year this one is," then turned and walked behind the Carter property fence. The physician did not pursue. It always contained a single word, sometimes handwritten, sometimes typed, once cut from newsprint. Again. Only a photograph, identical in composition to the one Lyle had taken, but this one darker, less sharp, and impossibly the boy was facing the other way. She spent 4 months collecting scattered reports, assembling fragments of letters, testimonies, and misfiled ledgers. Her goal was to build a coherent chronology of the events tied to Julian Carter, what she referred to in her notes as the persistence of an unfinished life. The file she compiled, over 400 pages of cross-referenced material, vanished from her desk the week before her scheduled presentation at the Historical Society of Suffolk County. Her resignation letter arrived 2 days later, brief and unambiguous. "I was mistaken. He is not repeating. We are." Despite the absence of formal inquiry, traces of the case began to influence policy in imperceptible ways. A line added to the 1870 Boston Department of Health guidelines stipulated that cases of unexplained biological irregularity should be referred directly to state authorities and sealed from public record. No such cases were ever logged, but the clause remained. Ivy overtook the second-story windows. One of the fence posts rusted completely through and was never replaced, yet no one entered the lot. Children invented games that skirted the fence line, never crossing it, never looking inside. They called it the age game, unaware of the origin, only the rule. No one moves faster than the others, or they are left behind. A retired mail clerk, who had served the Faro Street route for 3 decades, kept a private drawer of returned letters addressed to Julian Carter. Most were empty. A few contained pages torn from hymnals or medical pamphlets. One bore a crude drawing of a clock with 2 sets of hands, one moving forward, the other backward. On the envelope, in uneven script, the words, When the hands meet, he will be done. Years later, in an unmarked drawer of the city archives, a final document was found. It bore no header, no date, and no known author. The paper was brittle, the ink faded. It appeared to be a statement, written in first person. The handwriting did not match any known sample from Carter, his parents, or the officials involved. It read, "They tried to help, but I frightened them. I tried to stop, but the days come too quickly. I think I had a brother, or maybe he was me. One of us was younger. I don't know which. My bones don't know how to wait anymore. I sleep less. I wake less. I am not certain which of us they buried. I think I left him behind." The house simply fell into deeper silence. But during the winter of 1872, a local child disappeared from a nearby block. His name was not Julian. His age was 9. His shoes were found in front of the Carter fence, placed neatly side by side, facing inward. The building was struck from blueprints, reclassified as green space, then heritage land, then forgotten. A new generation grew up with no knowledge of what the house had held. The lot was left undisturbed, a quiet indentation in a growing city. As if the building refused to be excluded. The ground where it stood was leveled, paved, and later repurposed as part of a tramway expansion. But in the cement between the tracks, one worker carved something before the concrete dried. It remains partially visible beneath the rusted rails.